Hi everyone, welcome. It's absolutely my pleasure to welcome you to the first inaugural talk within our Law and Psychology series. This talk is sponsored with ACS as part of our Brown versus Ford commemoration of the 60th year, and also with BALSA as well. And it's absolutely my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brenda Major. Dr. Brenda Major is a leader in the field of social psychology who investigates prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. She is a social psychologist and a professor above scale in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's the author of approximately 150 articles, peer-reviewed journals, and book chapters on justice, stigma, and self-esteem, and intergroup relations. She's also co-edited a volume with John Jost entitled The Psychology of Legitimacy. Dr. Major is a fellow of American Psychological Association, the Association of Psychological Sciences, and has served as the president of both the Society of Personality and Social Psychology and the Society of Experimental Social Psychology. Her research examines the psychology of stigma, the psychological justification of inequality, including gender equality, and the antecedents and consequences of perceived discrimination and unfair treatment. Her research also addresses how cultural ideologies such as the American dream shape people's likelihood of perceiving discrimination, as well as their cognitive, emotional, and behavioral responses to perceived discrimination against themselves and others. Recently, I'm excited to say she's been awarded many accolades, but most recently the 2013 Kurt Lewin Prize from the Society of Psychological Study and Social Issues. Today, Brenda Major will present Presumed Fair, How Diversity Initiatives Shape Perceptions of Discrimination. So let's welcome her.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. Can you all hear me in the back? Yeah. They said that this is on, but okay. So actually I like the title that you said better than this title, so we'll go with that one. Today I want to talk about the paradoxical effect of diversity initiatives on perceptions of procedural fairness and discrimination against underrepresented groups. Yeah, we probably could use that over there for somebody else. It looks like we got a pretty full house. My focus isn't on whether diversity initiatives are effective at increasing diversity, but rather on how they affect people's perceptions of the fairness of organizations and how they affect people's likelihood of detecting discrimination or their sensitivity to seeing discrimination. And in particular, what I'm going to ask as we go through a series of studies is, do diversity initiatives create an illusion of fairness in the eyes of other people? My perspective is that of experimental social psychology. So I know that not all of you are experimental social psychologists. Some of you are in the law school. Some of you are in other departments. So just sort of a heads up, sort of the perspective that I bring to this work is one that asks, how does the social context shape individual perception, motivation, emotion, physiology, and behavior? And that perspective that we apply, the methodology we apply, uses carefully controlled experiments where we randomly assign people to see one kind of information or another kind of information, and then we measure a dependent variable across those conditions. And the beauty of this technique is that it allows for determination of cause and effect. So in combination with other kinds of research, it provides a much richer and much deeper understanding of what's going on. So for some of you who aren't used to this methodology, just sort of give you a sort of perspective on sort of how we're going to approach the data. So as you would clearly know, if you live in America, diversity is big business in America, and promoting diversity is big business in America. Due to the changing demography of the U.S., as well as increasing numbers of women entering the workforce, the vast majority of organizations, big organizations in the United States, are now promoting diversity and the inclusion of women and people of color, and they include it in their mission statements, and they have a variety of programs that are introduced, and there are big consulting companies that are introducing all different kinds of programs. There's a lot of money in promoting diversity these days. And broadly, the aim of diversity initiatives is a very good one. It's promoting the fair treatment of people with different, from different groups, with different attitudes, with different attributes. In general, though, diversity initiatives typically include targeting members of underrepresented groups, trying to increase their representation, increase the extent to which they feel included in the workforce. So I was looking at your Indiana University mission statement to see if you had a similar statement, and you do. I don't know what it means that Indiana University strives to achieve full diversity, but it's there. The word is there as part of your mission statement, as it's part of so many organizations' mission statement. Interestingly, there's all kinds of different practices that are applied in organizations. Diversity initiatives, culture audits, appointing diversity managers, diversity performance evaluations, advertising and self-promoting oneself as having won diversity awards. The biggest one is diversity training. The origin of diversity programs as they're implemented today can be traced back to anti-discrimination measures adopted back in the 1960s, and affirmative action programs in the 80s that have sort of morphed into diversity programs as of today. And they're often called a multicultural approach, in that they aim to expand and capitalize on the diversity of the workforce. Interestingly enough, however, despite the widespread adoption of diversity valuing initiatives across companies and the spending of millions and millions of dollars on consultants and people whose aim is to promote diversity, we know surprisingly little about their effects. Surprisingly little good research has actually addressed, do they make companies, for example, more diverse? There are a growing number of studies in social psychology, but still only a handful, that indicate that diversity initiatives can offer benefits. For example, changing the norms surrounding the expression of prejudice, enhancing knowledge of other cultural groups, increasing organizational trust amongst members of minority groups. It's also the case that there's a handful of studies that suggest that they increase group stereotyping, and they may lead to backlash among white employees. So are they effective, though, at their stated aim, which is to increase the diversity of organizations? And that's really a very interesting question. There is a very beautiful and elegant study that actually prompted the line of work I'm going to talk about, conducted by Caleb and Dobbins, who analyzed over 30 years of data from over 700 US organizations, and they used statistical analyses that enabled them to tell whether, subsequent to implementing a diversity initiative within a company, if they followed that company, was there any evidence that the introduction of the diversity initiative subsequently led to increased diversity in the company. And what they concluded, quite simply, was that most of the programs didn't work. Most diversity initiatives didn't increase diversity among the diversity of the workforce or of the managerial workforce. In fact, the most popular diversity initiative, the most widely used one, which is diversity training, had very little effect, and in fact for black women actually seemed to, if anything, decrease the representation of black women in management positions. So some of the things that we are promoting, using, and introducing in companies most commonly are having no effect. There was a recent review published just this past year of all the literatures on the effectiveness of diversity training in particular that came to the same conclusion, that there's no evidence that diversity training makes companies any less likely to discriminate against minorities or against women. And there's some similar findings from research on sexual harassment, that when a company introduces grievance channels to preemptively stop sexual harassment, that in fact they don't have any fewer lawsuits against them. I was at a conference at Stanford, a conference on new legal realism. I was looking at discrimination in the law. And I heard Caleb and Dobbins talk about their work and the work that they had done on, are these programs in fact effective at achieving their stated aim? And after I heard that talk, I heard Lauren Edelman give a talk. And basically what she did was a study of over 1,000 federal civil rights legal decisions over a 35-year period. And what they found was that over time, judges increasingly deferred to the presence of diversity initiatives in a company when they were finding and about discrimination cases. In other words, they referenced these decisions in their cases. They deferred to their presence, basically, on the assumption that if a company had a diversity initiative, such as diversity training in place, then that company was less likely to be seen as, in fact, having intended to discriminate, and they were less likely to find in favor of discrimination on claimants. So I listened to these two talks, sort of back to back. Diversity initiatives don't seem to really be doing what they're stated to do. Judges are deferring to them on the assumption that in fact they are creating change. And it led my colleague Cheryl Kaiser and I to ask, could it be that the mere presence of a diversity initiative blinds people to seeing discrimination even when it clearly exists? I mean, is the mere presence of these initiatives within a firm enough? If everything else is held constant, if discrimination is really clear, is this the case? Now, this is exactly the kind of question that an experimental social psychologist is perfectly prepared to answer, because we can carefully control the content of information, we can manipulate the presence or absence of a diversity initiatives, and we can measure the effects on perceptions and sensitivity to seeing discrimination. And so that's basically what we decided to do. We basically argued that here's the process that we hypothesized, that the presence of a diversity initiative within an organization acts as a legitimizing cue. It signals to people, to observers, that the organization is procedurally fair for women and minorities. And what do we know about procedural fairness? We know that the perception of procedural fairness enhances the perceived fairness of decisions and outcomes, and it's particularly likely to do so when outcomes are unfavorable. In other words, if a diversity cue signals the company is procedurally fair to minorities or women, then that increases the likelihood that the distribution of outcomes within that company are going to be seen as fair. So we hypothesized what we called the illusion of fairness hypothesis, that among high status groups, the mere presence of diversity initiatives would increase the perceptions of procedural fairness for lower status groups, and that they would do so, it would have this effect even when it was clear that there was distributive unfairness in the organization. In other words, women would be perceived as being treated, or minorities would be perceived as being treated in a procedurally fair way, i.e. with respect, listened to consistently, even when there was evidence that, for example, they were being paid less, or they were being less likely to be promoted. So I'm going to go through a series of experiments that test this hypothesis, this illusion of fairness hypothesis. So the first study we did asked whether the presence of diversity training legitimizes sex discrimination in hiring. So in this study, white adult men read the profile of a company. They got a little bit of information about the company, and in reading about the company, there was a paragraph that was about the general managerial training at the company or diversity training at the company. So in the managerial training program, they read that, this is the control group, that all management level employees are required to participate in a mandatory training program called Fostering Employee Success. The goal to improve communication, develop increased sensitivity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here, they're required to participate in a mandatory program called Fostering Women's Success. And the goal is for improved communication among male and female employees, managing gender diversity, etc. So in all other respects, every other bit of information that the participants in this study see is identical, except for these few lines that are embedded in the description of the company, okay, in terms of what kind of training programs it has for its managers. Now, after they read about this company, they then are shown on the computer screen the applicants, 40 applicants for a managerial position. 20 of them are female, 20 of them are male, They're matched for qualifications and counterbalanced, so and basically the male and female applicants have exactly the same credentials. They are asked to identify the top 10 candidates that to put on a short list for interview. So they see that merit material, then the computer screen turns to the actual short list that the company selected to interview. And that actual short list had 7 men and 3 women, the 7 most qualified men and the 3 most qualified women. So there was clearly, given that the men and women were identically qualified, there was clearly disparity in their likelihood of being interviewed. The dependent variables were perceptions of procedural justice for women. For example, Smith and Simon treats women with respect. Smith and Simon values women's opinion. Smith and Simon treats women consistently, applies procedures consistently, and whether they would be likely to support discrimination litigation at Smith and Simon. So if women brought a class action suit at Smith and Simon, how likely would you be to find in favor of the women who sued? And what our results showed for procedural justice was a significant effect, basically that the men who were in the diversity condition, the yellow bar, saw the company as significantly more procedurally fair for women than the men who were in the control condition. They also were significantly less likely to say that they would support a class action suit if women brought it against the company. Furthermore, the perception of procedural fairness for women mediated this effect. In other words, the presence or absence of the diversity initiative affected the extent to which they thought women were treated with respect, listened to, and then that, in fact, decreased their support for a class action suit brought by women. Now you might ask, did they notice the unfair treatment? Maybe they didn't notice it. Maybe they didn't see, for example, that in fact the women were equally qualified, or maybe they didn't recognize what the materials were, but in fact they did. The diversity condition didn't affect participants' estimates of the number of women who were on the lists or their recall of the average qualifications, and they correctly recalled men and women as equally qualified. So this is a case where clearly there is a disparity in the in who gets interviewed between men and women, but nonetheless the presence of the diversity cue had a small but significant effect on perceptions. So what about wage discrimination? I mean, does the mere presence of diversity training legitimize wage discrimination against women? So we use very similar procedure to explore whether, in fact, if people saw that, in fact, women with identical credentials were being paid less than identically qualified men, would you see the same effect? So we created a situation where people looked at the average pay given to men and women across 10 departments within a company. The only difference was the information that they had about the company, whether they had training programs fostering women's success or training programs fostering employee success. And what we found was basically the same effect. The yellow bar, again, is the diversity condition. The blue bar is the employee success condition. The company was seen as more procedurally fair for women, and they were less likely to believe that sexism was present in the company if the diversity cue was there. So, okay, so what about, so those are, lab studies where we create the information about the company. Let's take this sort of out into the real world, and to do that, we approached this question a little differently. We took an article that had appeared in the New York Times. We approached white men in the Seattle community, 85% of whom reported being currently or previously full-time employed. They read a real New York Times article describing a class action bias-related suit, Velas versus Novartis Pharmaceuticals, that was tried in the US District Court. And what we did is some of the people, half of the people, we stopped here. And for the other half of the people, we included this last sentence, which in fact was in the original article. What does that sentence say? It says, Novartis denies the claims, it's proud of its record in hiring and promoting women. Amy Bass, a lawyer, said she noted that Novartis had been cited by Working Mother magazine as one of the 100 best companies in the nation for 10 years in a row through 2009. Now, one of the interesting things about these awards is there's often very little oversight. Human resources officers put their company in for these awards. They're great marketing, but not so much evidence that they're in fact based on reality. Novartis actually, they found against Novartis in this case. But so basically, people are reading a New York Times article. The only difference is this last sentence included or not. And we asked, basically, did they believe that Novartis valued women's opinions, treated them with respect, the same procedural justice items as before? And we asked them, if you were a juror, how likely would you be to find in favor of the class of women who sued Novartis? Would this sentence in a newspaper article make a difference? And obviously, I wouldn't show it to you. It didn't, but it does. It was remarkable, but basically, the presence of that sentence increased perceptions of procedural justice for women, and significantly decreased their likelihood of saying that if they were a juror, they would find in favor of the class of women suing Novartis. Is this limited to gender discrimination? No, it's not. We did a study with 150 white adults on MTurk, the majority of whom were women. They read about a company. In the company description, they read either its mission statement or they read its diversity statement. And the diversity statement and the mission statement differed in only a few words. Promoting employee excellence, promoting employee diversity. Then they read a lawsuit brought against the company by a black employee claiming he was discriminated against. That was based off of a lawsuit that we'd read about in the newspaper. So they read basically like a newspaper article about this black plaintiff who's bringing a claim of racial discrimination. And then they rated how valid did they think that employee's claim was, and how did they feel about that claimant? What did they believe about him? How did they feel towards him? So did they believe he was discriminated against? Did they believe he was treated unfairly? And what were their attitudes towards him? Did they think he was likable, friendly? Did he have a good personality? Would they like to work with him? Those kind of questions. And so the question is, did the presence, when they started reading about this company, of that diversity statement, that sort of general diversity statement, make a difference? And so what we found again was they saw, in this case they read an actual discrimination claim. They were less likely to see the claim as valid if there was a diversity initiative present, if they had read that diversity mission statement, and they had less positive attitudes towards the claimant. In other words, they derogated the discrimination claimant. So if if the company is fair to minorities and women, and he brings a claim against that company, then the claim is less valid, and he is less likable, has less of a good personality, they're less likely to want to work with him. Again, this very minor tweaking of information about the company seems to have these rather interesting and disturbing effects. So we also wanted to know, okay, so far we've created the information, or in the Novartis case, this is what was said in the New York Times. We wanted to try a different approach. So what we did is we recruited white managers, and we asked them to reflect upon their own company, to think about the company at which they worked. And we asked them to think about and write about either their own company's efforts to promote diversity. What is your company doing to promote diversity? Or what is your company doing to promote environmental sustainability? So in this case, everybody's recruited. They're asked to think about one or the other thing. And then they read an EEOC racism case, and they're asked to imagine that this case was filed at their company. Okay, so they've thought about, we've primed thoughts about what my company does to promote diversity, or what my company does to promote environmental sustainability. Then they read this case. And what we wanted to know is, how do they feel about the validity of this claim? Does the claimant have a legitimate case? Would you support the person who's making this claim? And in this case, what we found was that if they simply thought about diversity initiatives that were present within their own company, it made them see this EEOC claim as less valid, and it made them less likely to support the claimant in this case. So we also wanted to know, what about if it's real lawyers? And here, Victor comes into play and helps in this study. Anybody here participate in this study? I mean, 205 law students from Indiana University evaluate a bench memo seeking summary judgment in an actual racism case. Victor was extremely helpful in getting actual cases. We condensed them down. We created a bench memo based on that case. Law students went online, read the bench memo, and afterwards we asked them to make judgments about how likely, if you were a judge, for example, reviewing this case, how likely would you be to grant summary judgment in favor of the company? The company was WRT Transfer, in favor of Harris's discrimination claim. Harris was an African-American male who claimed that he was unfairly fired. And we asked them how willing they would be to represent the plaintiff and how willing they would be to represent the company. Now, the bench memo description of the case is identical except for one little statement. In one condition, the company says, the WR Transport contests and says, discrimination is inconsistent with our diversity-oriented mission and our diversity awards, very similar to the Novartis case, okay? So there's a line. There's a line in the bench memo. Now, clearly, people who are studying law are not going to fall victim to this illusion, right? I mean, they're going to see right through this. It's not going to affect them, right? So, in fact, the presence of that sentence increased the likelihood that these law students, in fact, would find in favor of WR Transport, summary judgment, relative to the control group. The other thing that happens that's very interesting is it increases their willingness to represent Harris. So here's the control group. The law students are predominantly Democrat, liberal here at IU, and in the control group, they showed that they would prefer to represent Harris rather than the company. They don't want to be on the side of the angels here in this case. However, in the presence of the diversity cue, that disappears. So it increases their willingness to represent the company if, in fact, this diversity cue is present. Which, if you think back to Lauren Edelman's research on judicial deference, makes some sense, right? Judges are going to defer to the presence of this when they're reading the case. So it clearly affects the lawyer's willingness to represent the company in this case. So, so far, we've gone through a series of experiments using a series of different approaches to ask, how do members of higher status groups, men evaluating women, whites evaluating minorities, how does the presence of diversity cues affect their likelihood of seeing discrimination? But we could also ask, do organizational initiatives also decrease sensitivity to seeing discrimination among members of underrepresented groups, among women, among ethnic minorities? Do they have the same effects when they're about your own group, for example? And our research suggests yes, but it depends on the group. So we've now done, with Cheryl, we've done several studies in which we've shown that basically women show the same susceptibility to this illusion of fairness as men do when they're dealing with gender discrimination. That they seem to show exactly the same effects. So the presence of a diversity initiative decreases their sensitivity to seeing sex discrimination against women. But for ethnic minorities, it's a more interesting and more complex story. Basically, we thought that it may depend upon whether people believe that the system is fair or not. If you believe that the system is basically a fair system, the presence of diversity cues may have the same effect. But if you believe that the system is not fair, it may not have that effect. So we basically argued that for members of low status groups, people's basic beliefs about is the system fair, their ideologies. Do I believe that success depends on hard work? Do I believe that anybody can get ahead in America irrespective of their group membership if they work hard or if they're talented? Basically, you could think of these as system justifying ideologies or, the ethos of the American dream. Anybody can make it here. So what we found is that among ethnic minorities, whether or not we saw this illusion of fairness depended upon their system fairness beliefs. So what we did was a study in which we had Latino participants see basically they read about a company that was described as having won diversity awards or just general employee excellence awards. Afterwards, they read a discrimination case brought by a Latino employee who was claiming that he was discriminated against at this very company based upon his ethnicity. And we asked them then those same procedural justice questions. How fair do you think that this company treats minorities? Do they treat them with respect? Do they value their opinions? And what we found here, as you can see, is for minorities who endorsed system justifying beliefs like the Protestant work ethic, which is the one we used in the study, the belief that hard work pays off, that success is due to working hard. What we found is the same effect that we had seen among our white participants and the same effect that we had seen among women when they were judging gender discrimination. But for minorities who are one standard deviation below the mean, this is one standard deviation above the mean in endorsement of these system fairness beliefs. This is showing you the means for minorities who are one standard deviation below the mean in endorsing these system justifying beliefs. There we see no effects whatsoever of the diversity initiative. They don't believe that, that affects the likelihood that minorities at this company are treated any more fairly or not. We also found that it affects among minorities who endorse system justifying beliefs, it affects the perceived likelihood of discrimination against Latinos. So if we look at the diversity awards, which are in blue, the control awards, which is in yellow, we see a significant difference, but only among minorities who believe the system is fair. And that these beliefs, these system justifying beliefs or ideologies, are not about race. They're just general beliefs that the system is procedurally fair, right? So they're not about race in particular, they're much more general beliefs, but they frame how people are viewing clearly these diversity initiatives. And for minorities who don't embrace them, the diversity initiatives are not having those same effects. We've since seen this in some other studies. So lately, we've been pushing our work in some other directions. So we've looked at how it affects whites' perceptions of companies and organizations. We've looked at how it's affecting minorities' perceptions of discrimination in organizations. We've also begun to ask, how do diversity initiatives affect whites' perceptions of discrimination against whites? Does the presence of diversity initiatives increase perceptions of reverse discrimination? Does the presence of diversity initiatives increase perceptions of threat or anticipation among whites that they're going to be the targets of discrimination? So when we started this work, we thought of it in terms of the increased perceptions of the extent to which minorities and women are treated fairly. And we saw that that mediates the effect. Does it also, however, operate through another process, which it increases the likelihood that I think my group is going to be discriminated against? Does it decrease perceptions of procedural fairness in treatment of whites? And what are the effects there? So that was the question. Do diversity initiatives signal to whites that they're potential targets of prejudice and discrimination? So I thought I would describe a study that is not yet published. It's under review. It's a really interesting study, though. I think that that you might find fun, and I've been moving through my other research kind of quickly so that I could get to this one and talk about it because it's my newest one. So in this study, we had white male participants come into our lab, and we told them that they were going to take part in a study of managerial decision making. In fact, they were told that they were going to be going through a job application to applying to work for a company, and we were really interested in how actual managers make hiring decisions. So this was to go through this as if it was a real job application, that managers were going to be viewing basically the different interviews of the different people. and that we were going to hook them up, and we were going to get their physiological data, and we were going to present all this to the managers afterwards. And we also gave them an incentive. We said the people who basically got the job, did the best, we were going to give $100 to. So they were highly motivated to, get the job, so to speak. And they knew that they were going to be looked at by a real company. So everybody's told basically that they are going to go through this job interview. And then they see a 5-minute, very slick company description. It's a video presentation that describes what the company does and all about it. It's based upon, you go online, you'll find lots of these. Their promotion, welcome to our company, let us tell you about our company slides. But there's just a couple slides that differ in this entire 5-minute presentation. And they differ in the way it describes the corporate culture. In one of the presentations, the slide emphasizes diversity, diverse experiences, perspectives, and ethnic backgrounds. The picture is of people who are diverse. It's promote trust, respect, attract, maintain a talented, diverse workshop, and encourage collaboration between diverse employees. In the other condition, the corporate culture is unique perspectives, promote trust, respect, and dignity, attract, develop, promote talented workshop between employees. It's the differences between these fairly slick and long slideshows are really quite trivial. They're really, really small, okay? Now you see this slide presentation, and while you're told you're gonna be interviewed for a job. And while you interview for this job, we're gonna hook you up to physiological equipment. So actually what happens is when the students come into the lab, we hook them up and we do 5 minutes of baseline cardiovascular measurement. We measure heart rate and ventricular contractility. We measure total peripheral resistance, which you can think of as vasoconstriction in the arteries. And we measure cardiac output, which is how much blood the heart is pumping. So we're measuring 4 different measures of cardiovascular measures. And we look at reactivity. So we have their baseline, and we have then their physiological responses during the interview. Okay, so they know that we're monitoring them during the interview. And during the interview, we ask them 5 questions that have to do with the job, including the question, how would you, add to the corporate culture? How would you contribute to the corporate culture? Now, cardiovascular reactivity, as I mentioned, we measure it during a 5-minute baseline period, and we measure it during the interview. The key variables that we're looking at are total peripheral resistance, vasoconstriction, and cardiac output, how much blood the heart pumps per minute, and we create a threat challenge index, which is basically changes in TPR minus changes in cardiac output. Okay. And the key here, why is this important? Oh, I have to get one more slide here. Why is this important? These cardiovascular indices are predictive that the challenge response is one that you see when people are motivated, approach motivated, they are eager. It's also associated with anger, but it's usually associated with positive emotions. It's a more physiologically adaptive response. So when you're stressed, imagine you're taking a test, your heart is beating, right? Your heart rate's up, your blood is pumping hard, and your arteries are constricted, and you're all stressed out in a sense. Your blood pressure's up, but no, you're not pumping much. You don't have much cardiac output. That's a threat pattern. The challenge pattern: your heart is beating fast. Your blood pressure's up, but your arteries aren't constricted, and you're actually pumping a lot of blood. You're going to run faster from the lion. I think of it as sort of like a squish kind of concept, that you're basically, things are very constricted. And it's associated with vigilance too. This threat pattern is associated with kind of a vigilance stance, threat or vigilance stance. So basically what we found, just to sort of summarize, because I have to go quickly here, is that the white men who were interviewing for a job that had these minor cues that described company as having a corporate culture that promoted diversity, showed a threat pattern, a physiological response during the job interview. whereas those who were interviewing for the job that was just described as stressing uniqueness showed a challenge pattern of physiology during the job interview. So this is across the 5-minute job interview. We also asked them subsequently, did they think they'd be treated fairly at the company? White men thought they would be treated more fairly in the neutral company than they thought they would be treated in the pro-diversity company. And interestingly, they also thought that in the neutral company, white men thought that the company was more likely to discriminate against minorities than it would against whites. But in the pro-diversity company, white men thought that the company would be more likely to discriminate against whites than it would against minorities. So they're put in the same situation of the same vigilance for discrimination that I've seen in some of my other work with minorities who think that they might be a victim of discrimination, showing the same physiological, pathophysiological patterns. So to summarize, diversity initiatives, I think we know can have important benefits, but what I think this work suggests is they may also have some other unintended consequences. Even if they're ineffective, they can lead to an illusion of fairness among high status groups and low status groups who think the system's fair. It can decrease detection of real discrimination that exists against low status groups and increase perceptions of discrimination among high status groups against their own group. What are the implications of this? Well, I think one of the implications is that we need to shift the conversation from merely showcasing diversity initiatives to actually looking at accountability and effectiveness. I think it really emphasizes the importance of using evidence-based approaches to understanding diversity initiatives. Companies, universities are spending billions on organizational consultants who are coming in and putting us all through training programs that don't seem to be working and might be having some other kinds of effects. We need to be doing research on, in fact, what are their effects, how can they be made more effective, and I think that it also shows the benefits of integrating psychological science with issues of law and social policy. And I'd like to thank a number of people who've collaborated with me on the diversity project, including our very own Victor, so thank you very much.
We have about 15 minutes that we can use for questions, so if there's any questions, this would be the time to answer them.
Can we turn that off? It's really bad, just the projector. It's,
Oh,
if
yeah.
I stand here and look at you, I'm getting a, it'll shut itself down briefly. Okay, perfect. Questions? This is my favorite part. Don't leave me stranded here. Ask me a question. Yes?
It's a data question. When you said that in studying the minority groups, you tested for system validating beliefs. Did you do the same for white participants?
We have done that same thing for white participants. So far, we're not seeing effects among our white participants. And in that physiology study, the one I just showed you, what's really interesting about that, and I didn't take the time to show you, is those, the men who were in that study, we had measures on them of group identification and prejudice, the system justifying beliefs and motivations to avoid prejudice and implicit bias, and you can, I mean, we had 20 measures on them, none of it moderate the physiological effects. They're all threatened if they're interviewing for a job described as promoting diversity. Yes?
On your implication slide, you had that companies need to show that they are not just advertising for diversity, but they are actually being effective in their diversity measures. At the beginning of the presentation, you stated that diversity training programs, which are one of the most popularized but least effective ways of increasing diversity, are not being successful. So what can companies do to promote diversity if what they're currently doing is ineffective?
I mean, that's a really good question. I am not an organizational consultant. I have no stake in this pie. I think that's a mixed metaphor, but you get my point, So I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think there's some very good intentions that are going on. There are some things that do seem to work, and if I had this thing turned on, can I see on here? Can I go back on this one? I can probably see it. I wonder if you can go back. Oh, I could go back on this. If you go back to the Edelman, if I could go backwards, I don't know how to do this on this thing. I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning. How do I get out of the slide thing? There's a slide I'm going to show you. This is the reason why I'm doing this. Exit show. Here we go. I'm going to go back all the way to the Caleb and Dobbins study because this slide, is this one going to come up? No. Okay, but I can tell you, basically mentoring programs had a positive effect, a diversity task force. And so if you look over here, there were a couple of programs. They were not very commonly used programs, but there were a couple of programs that actually did seem to be working. They were not the most commonly used ones though. So based upon those data, which I think are the most comprehensive in terms of they're not experimental, but they're longitudinal, I would think those seem to be more effective. Yes?
I'm wondering about maybe a way of understanding what this issue of perceptions of fairness of the system as a whole might be about. And in particular, what I'm wondering about are models of discrimination. That is, it seems to me to make perfect sense that people would think information about diversity initiatives would lower the likelihood of discrimination if we think what discrimination is animus.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's an indication that the organization doesn't hold those bad hostile attitudes, right? They're positive, they want to do something good. So we don't think that they have that model of discrimination. If, on the other hand, you hold a model of discrimination that takes into account unconscious bias and or structural discrimination, then the existence of a diversity initiative is irrelevant with respect to both of those things, right? Could easily coexist with that. So what I'm wondering is whether you think that the perception of fairness of the system might be a kind of shorthand or rough way of getting at people's understanding of alternative models of discrimination, and conversely, whether you might be able to shift these perceptions some if they actually got some education about alternative models of discrimination.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yes, I couldn't have said it better. I think that's very interesting perspective. And I haven't asked the question of whether people who differ in these system-justifying ideologies have alternative models of discrimination. Clearly, they have different perceptions of their likelihood of being a victim of discrimination. I mean, the more minorities believe and endorse system-justifying beliefs, the less likely they are to believe that they will be a victim of discrimination. The less likely they are to interpret ambiguous events as discriminatory. My work shows that they have a whole set of unfolding characteristics. They shape how people respond when they encounter discrimination. Minorities who believe the system is fair respond in much more adaptive ways cardiovascularly when they're interviewed by a member of a different ethnic group. They don't anticipate discrimination. They're not vigilant. They look cardiovascularly, they're challenged, unless they have reason to believe that he's prejudiced, and then they show a threat pattern because it violates their worldview. So I think that, but I haven't looked specifically at models of discrimination, but I think it's a really interesting one. Yes?
Did you ask about whether individuals have been discriminated
against? Yes, we have. We haven't found that as a moderator variable thus far, but we do ask that question.
And you ask it both of minorities and also of whites?
We have, yes. It's something I always ask, and usually in our participants. I mean, we have fewer studies where we've looked at minority respondents. We do have that question. Of course, if you take the system-justifying beliefs, high endorsement of system-justifying beliefs, greater perceptions of having, lower perceptions of having been discriminated against. So you could take, this is an interesting question. This is just an interesting observation for those of you who are, nerds like me. So the perceptions of discrimination as an individual difference variable, predicting these various responses, cardiovascular, self-esteem, etc., do not predict as well as these broad ideologies about fairness. They're correlated, but often we get no effects for those. It's these very subtle, it's like the water around you, the belief that I'm living in a system that is fair, and if I work hard, I can get ahead. That is it's a much more global system. We get much stronger effects. Yes?
I have a specific question and a general one. The more specific one is for your study with the managers. Did any of the people, when they were writing or thinking, come up with instances in which the diversity efforts were ineffective? And I wonder if efficacy would sort of get rid of the effect, or maybe it's as long as you're trying to be fair, trying to have these initiatives, it doesn't matter if they're effective or not.
You know, I don't recall. I mean, this was an experimental, you know, they either did it, they either were in that condition or they won't, and we looked at the effects of the experimental induction, not at actually what they wrote about. I mean, if I had to guess, I would say that, you know, if people wrote about why they were ineffective, it would probably lessen the effect and maybe not show up if we were to go back. And if I wrote about ineffective diversity, if you got people thinking maybe about, you primed different things, I wouldn't be surprised if you might change the effects and get people to show the effect less. If they thought about the effectiveness of it, that would make sense to me. I think the issue about just trying, is it enough to know? It comes back to your issue about what is a discrimination model of discrimination. If a company says that it's trying not to discriminate, but you know, for a lot of, I mean, my understanding is many lawyers advise companies that you need these diversity things, you need to say you have them because they're very effective window dressing in the law, right? I've just given you 8 studies to show you that. You know? Yes, EJ.
So it seems like you have a situation where you should see a lot of self-fulfilling prophecies, right? People having spoken to companies that put forward these statements are going to be procedurally fair and better towards minorities and women, but they're not. They don't seem to be doing that. Do you think that that has to do with the other part of your research where you show that, you know, the majority of people feel threatened by these particular, you know, statements in our industry? Do you think that that's undoing these potential self-fulfilling prophecies, or do you think that maybe they're just not motivated enough to do anything to feel like things are all right the way that they are?
I'm not sure I'm following your question, so let me sort of see if I'm rephrasing it or answering it, and if not, just lead me in another direction. So what I think I'm hearing is people think that they believe that the companies, that these diversity programs make companies more, they value women or minorities more, and they listen to them more, and they make them more procedurally fair, but they don't seem to be actually increasing the diversity of companies, right? Why is that going on? Is that what I'm,
Yeah,
the
why would
meta
you go
question?
in with those expectations? Are those expectations not fulfilled when you would be expecting to be treated fairly? And
If you're a minority.
yeah.
If you're a minority and you
Or if you're a majority member, you expect that the company is going to be fairer towards minority members, so then
you
might treat
expect they're going to
minorities-
be less fair to you.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're a majority member, you
That's
expect.
That's my question.
Yeah.
Is that the reason why that self-fulfilling prophecy is not working?
Well, I think that there are some studies that have looked at backlash. I mean, so one of the interesting things that's potentially going on, I mean, so Valerie Purdy-Vance has some very nice work where she shows that, you know, a company that says it's multicultural, but all of its pictures are white people, that sort of backfires. But in general, they make minorities feel better about their prospects of being treated fairly, but they make majority group members feel worse about their prospects for being treated fairly. So it creates a situation where, you know, you've got a different group feeling like it's going to be at the receiving end of unfair treatment. So I think, yeah, it's a very interesting set of dynamics. It'd be kind of fun to think about an interaction where you could look at people under these different belief systems. So they seem to be having, I mean, one of the interesting things about asking about how do you think the company is going to treat majorities, whites versus minorities, in that control group, you'll recall, our white male students believed that company was probably more likely to discriminate against minorities than majority group, than whites. There was a pretty large difference, completely reversed in the presence of some very slight diversity cues, and we've seen that in several other studies. So that, I think, could be one reason. Yes?
So I'm curious, sort of building on that, the suggestion that, you know, we then assess diversity initiatives and hold them accountable and sort of measures, it seems like it might just compound that problem because it's very hard to have any sort of objective standard of quality. So if your measure is, well, this company with this diversity policy in place, you know, has 10% of their vice presidents are minority and 40% of them are women, it seems like that just might aggravate the problem of white men saying, well, this is not a fair company and those people don't deserve to be there. So I guess I'm curious, are there ways to sort of get at accountability without increasing the sense among
You may recall on my first slide, I said this is not about, the focus is not on the effectiveness of diversity programs, but on how they affect perceptions, because that's not my area of expertise. I mean, I think it's a great question, but I would be speculating just like you know, I think about what's the way out of this conundrum. I mean, I think that what we know from social psychological research is, you know, if we think of ourselves as a common in-group, unless, you know, your group and my group and we're separate groups and it's a, you know, zero-sum game, and if you advance this group, you'll advance that, decrease that group. There, you know, some research would suggest if you have a sort of common in-group identity model, maybe that would decrease it. I mean, I think those are really good questions. And I think they're the difficult ones for those of us who feel that this is an important goal. I mean, and it's, I mean, come on, the country is becoming more diverse. These are the facts of life, how to resolve this, you know, and this is, at its core, we're about, you know, intergroup conflict here, and it's about intergroup dynamics. And, you know, and diversity seems to prime, and Vicki Plout's got some nice work where she shows and primes thoughts of exclusion among whites, you know. So it's, you know, it seems to be having these effects on sort of increasing perceptions of group boundaries. It's consistent with the work suggesting that it increases multicultural cues, increase in group stereotypes, you know, sort of sharpens group boundaries. So, yes, somebody back here had a, yes.
It was related to that same question. Have there been any studies about qualitative diversity programs? For instance, what she was suggesting was the fact that some of these companies just give a quota of minorities that should be admitted, and then they think that is solving the diversity problem. Whereas when you mentioned about the mentorship programs, which seem to be more effective qualitatively, so has there been any studies about qualitative diversity programs that are better than other programs? So.
I don't know. I simply know, sort of in the longitudinal thing, that the mentorship programs seem to be a more effective approach.
Because that seems to be a more comprehensive system of where you say, okay, well, these are the problems with the system, and by identifying some white people in the establishment that can mentor women and that can mentor African Americans, make them more attuned to the problems of the group, of the out group, and make the in group and the out group understand each other then better, and then promoting diversity through understanding or mutual understanding. So, because in my mind, the problem of diversity is a problem of misunderstanding between groups, and if you're trying to just solve it through sheer numbers like companies try to do, then we are left with a problem of just, I would be suspicious of a job application where my being a minority was more important than what I knew. I'd be very suspicious about that, and I think other white people should be also suspicious about that, and that is what she was coming to, I guess.
Well, that's not what I was saying, so the right way of saying that one could imagine accountability measures that would have some sort of expected strict quotas.
We have time for about one more question.
Somebody had her hand up right there, yes.
I get the impression that people who have the illusion of fairness have the illusion of procedural fairness, right? That if a company claims to be inclusive or striving toward inclusiveness, which is sort of a distributive fairness idea.
Ultimately, right, I claim to have, I'm striving for distributive unfairness. Everybody's going to be treated, or they're going to have the same outcome. Distributive fairness is, you know, an outcome, judgment about the fairness of outcomes. Procedural fairness is about the judgment of the fairness of procedures. Like, do we apply rules consistently?
Right.
But, you know, the outcome's such that the best person gets promoted, or only white.
Since when a company is arguing that it has a diversity, an emphasis, a culture of diversity, it is implying representativeness, inclusiveness, and so on, which could be conceived as an outcome. Let me tell you what I'm getting at.
Okay. It's like fine points, but go, yes.
Okay, because if people are making the implicit assumption of procedural fairness, then perhaps the program needs to be emphasizing fairness of procedures rather than equality, equal representation in some ways. In other words, have you thought about manipulating an emphasis, the company's emphasis on fairness of treatment for all employees, as opposed to its emphasis on diversity per se?
I mean, simply where it just writes about fair treatment for, I haven't done that thus far.
Because it seems to me that there's this sort of blend in people's thinking that gives them the illusion of fairness, that they're somehow assuming that there must be procedural fairness in this company if it values diversity. Do you see what I'm saying?
I think that's what our data would show.
And so if you wanted to decouple that erroneous assumption that procedural fairness lies behind the emphasis on diversity, then perhaps an emphasis on procedural fairness as a company policy toward all employees, white, black, green, whatever, might have the effect of
Making them
removing
recognize,
Yeah.
well, it's interesting, so the data on perceptions of procedural and distributive fairness might suggest that, when there is in fact a disparity of outcomes, that's precisely when, if I tell you that the company's procedures were fair, you're going to say that the company is fair even though there is a disparity in outcomes, in other words. So it's still going to blind you potentially to, I think, the perception of discrimination if you've really got a disparity in outcome that's not based, for example, on merit or criteria like that.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
So let's go ahead and thank our Brenda Major.